At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches Episode 2. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 5 Josh, September 4th, 1946. After school, Josh rushed to the locker room, knowing he was going to have to run 3 extra laps for being late to football practice. The red and white football varsity jacket he was wearing flapped in the air as he sped through the corridors. When Josh approached the locker room, he quickly changed into his football uniform. Although Josh was the captain of the Willesden football team, he knew Coach McGurdy was not going to cut him any slack. Plus, he knew no excuse would work with the stoic and tough coach. There was no point in Josh explaining that his girlfriend Olivia wouldn't let him leave her alone. She was going on about something that happened to her while she was in detention, but Josh could care less about her delusions. What Josh needed to focus on during the new school year was getting the football scholarship for Willesden College. If he didn't get it, his mothers would literally disown him. Josh entered the gym and ran towards Coach McGurdy. The coach gave him a stern look and sighed. "Josh," she began in a disappointed tone. He nodded while panting, understanding her disappointment. "I know. I swear that will not happen again," Josh promised, genuinely sorry. However, he knew being sorry wouldn't cut it. Coach McGurdy shook her head. "I need you to understand what it means to be captain of the senior football team. Discipline, respect, skill, and most importantly being punctual," she lectured, crossing her buff arms and looking up at the 5'8" boy. "I understand you are in your junior year, but you must fulfill your duty because of your position. Do you hear me?" Josh nodded his head, desperately sorry. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said, narrowing her cold eyes. "Now scram and run 3 laps. Then begin the drills for the boys." Josh nodded and ran out the door, following the last of his teammates out to the football field. He began running around the field, determined to be the star player of the year. He trained hard for the past 2 years for this. This year was his only chance to get that scholarship because by his senior year it would be time to apply for his post-secondary schools. Josh didn't tell any of his friends about that, because they all thought he was rich enough to get into any school. That was a lie he made up when he started dating Olivia. Olivia was the wealthiest girl in school, and she only dates popular and rich boys. The lie benefited Josh in many ways. It increased his popularity, hid the fact that his goal was to get a scholarship, and gave him the chance to date Olivia and make his teammate Ronald jealous. Josh sped past Ronald, and purposely slammed his shoulder against the boy. This caused Ronald to notice Josh. "Hey Josh, what the hell was that for?" "It hurt," the dark-skinned boy said, his black cropped hair framing his hollow face. Josh scoffed at him. "Go cry about it to your mommy, I couldn't care less," he shouted scornfully, looking over his shoulder for a second before returning his gaze at the finish line in front of him. Ronald caught up to Josh's lengthy strides and panted while running alongside him. "Josh, remember how great of a team we used to make?" he suddenly asked, bringing up a topic Josh didn't want to speak about. "Why do you keep asking the same question, dogface?" Josh retorted, his pace accelerating. Ronald groaned and ran faster, catching up to Josh once again. "What's wrong, man? Why do you keep on acting like we didn't play football together since middle school?" Josh rolled his eyes and pumped his legs faster, desperate to get Ronald off his back. He was like a pesky wasp that was hard to get rid of. No matter how hard one tried to outrun it, one always heard it buzzing by their ear a second later. After a while, Josh could hear Ronald's heavy footsteps catching up to him again, and he groaned before speeding around the track at a faster rate. Unfortunately, Ronald managed to catch up. "Damn you, Ronald. You're my competition, that's why." Josh snapped, pushing Ronald. Ronald stumbled a little but managed to control his balance. "Competition for what? We're in the same damn team," Ronald remarked. Josh ignored the boy and began to speed past him, but Ronald caught the end of his jersey, halting his movements. "Let go," Josh shouted, panting as his legs ached from all the pointless running. Ronald wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand, his free hand still clutching Josh's jersey with a tight grip. "Not until you answer me," Ronald stubbornly replied. Josh exhaled and tilted his head towards the bright blue sky, wanting to be anywhere but here. They were standing in the middle of the track, many meters away from the rest of the team. They were both incredibly athletic and the best out of their entire team, but Josh always took pride in the fact that he was number 1, while Ronald always remained number 2. Ronald was the second tallest player, dating the second most popular girl in the school, Jessica. He was also the second person who needed the scholarship as much as Josh did. There were only 2 things the both of them had in common. They both liked Olivia and they both were poor as hell. The fact that they both wanted the same scholarship could be added, but Josh chose to ignore that. "You're my competition for the damn scholarship. I need it more than you do," Josh muttered, feeling quite uneasy telling Ronald this. He had no choice because if he wasn't straightforward with Ronald soon, he'd continue to bug him. Ronald gave him an appalled expression. "Really, Josh? Are you seriously saying that the reason you hate me and ignored me for so long is because of the scholarship?" Ronald exclaimed in disbelief, pain glinting in his dark brown eyes. "And what do you mean by needing the scholarship more than me? Josh, you know my family is broke. Pay for college yourself since you have pennies from heaven, and give others the opportunity." Josh gave Ronald a glaring look before violently swatting his hands away and ignoring his comments. He ran towards the middle of the field and called his team without looking back. "Boys, gather around in the middle of the field," Josh yelled, gesturing towards them. The boys followed his lead and huddled around their captain. "Let's make this year a good one, you skirt nerds," Josh exclaimed, pumping up his teammates. The boys whooped in agreement. "Let's start with the usual drills. Stanley and Ryan, get the jerseys and pylons prepared." The buff boys grunted in excitement and ran off into their positions. Josh gave his teammates high fives and fist bumps and ran towards his position on the field. Josh looked over his shoulder and waved at Coach McGurdy, and gave her a thumbs up. The football team began to run around the field and perform their drills. Josh played with them, focusing only on the sport and nothing more. His determined green eyes followed the football, and every time he caught the ball with his hands, adrenaline pumped through his veins. Josh recalled how much he used to love the sport. Now the only thing that matters about football to him is its ability to get him to college and fulfill his parents' wishes. Josh ran and ran, his calves flexing and his arms pumping up and down. His brown hair whirled in the cool wind, and he chucked the ball across the field. Josh felt like he was flying. His feet left the ground as he ran across the field. His arms flailed in the air. Blood left his legs as they felt empty. His shirt dropped down and hung over his face. His head ached because the entire world felt upside down. The wind whirled around his entire body, the air suddenly feeling hot instead of cool. Sweat dripped down his upside-down forehead, and his eyes rolled back. The entire world looked dark. It was hot and empty. It was so quiet he could hear his blood rushing to his forehead. Suddenly, on top of the pitch blackness, he saw 2 white figures. Both were female. It blinded his eyes. It blinded his mind. It took moments for Josh to realize that he wasn't on the football field. His heart beat rapidly against his chest as he attempted to open his eyes. He peeked, but it was still too bright to look. More sweat dripped down his face as Josh panted. Josh outstretched his hanging arms, trying to grab whatever was in front of him. Nothing. He felt nothing. It took another few moments for Josh to realize that he was upside down in the middle of the air. Dry tears streamed down Josh's face. "No. Why am I here? I have to train." Josh kicked his legs back and forth, but they felt empty and he couldn't move them. Josh panicked again. What the hell is happening? Is this real? Josh took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He allowed the bright light to engulf him. He opened his mouth to scream, talk, breathe, but nothing came out. Josh's green eyes widened in terror. So many things were happening at once. His head ached, his eyes couldn't see anything, his legs wouldn't move, his arms grabbed nothing, and his mouth couldn't speak. The only thing that worked was his beating heart, and the increasing heat he felt throughout his body. The heat was hot and sharp, cutting at his dry skin and burning him. Josh felt himself deteriorate as his body dropped to the ground at a fast pace. His head hit the ground and he awoke suddenly. Josh looked around, his eyes wide and bloody tears slowly dripping out of his eyes. Josh sat up and saw that a football was laying beside him, where his head rested previously. He looked up at his teammates standing around him. His watery eyes flickered back and forth until they landed at a spot across the field, over his teammates' shoulders. Josh squinted at the black amorphous blob he saw crawling towards him on all fours. Its raggedy black hair swished with a menacing flare as it bared its bloody teeth at him. At first, he thought it was a black ball or perhaps a dog approaching him, but as it came closer into view, he let out a horrified scream. It was human. "Josh, are you okay?" the curly-haired Ryan asked, his voice snapping Josh out of his hallucination. His head was spinning and blood was dripping from his eyes. "No, I look completely fine," he wanted to snidely remark, but no sound issued from his gaping mouth. Josh dizzily shook his head and he panted heavily, his sprawled limbs shaking as the brief image of the deranged human replayed in his head repeatedly. Coach McGurdy kneeled next to him and checked to see if he had a concussion. She held up 2 fingers in front of his slightly blurring eyes. "How many do you see, Josh?" "2," he choked as his throat was dry. His body felt charred as if he had just been burned. He raised his trembling hands and stroked his cheeks that were covered in dirt and bruises. He felt slimy liquid, and when he brought his hands down he realized that it was blood. McGurdy nodded her head. "Good. What happened?" he asked, wondering if everyone else saw what he saw. Coach McGurdy sighed. "Ronald accidentally chucked the ball straight to your head," she explained. "Although you don't appear seriously injured." Josh turned to look at Ronald, who was kneeling down beside him on his right. His face looked sorry, but Josh didn't care. Hatred was burning inside him. "What the hell, man?" he exclaimed, furrowing his eyebrows. Staring at Ronald furthered his headache, as anger boiled inside him. Despite the pain he was feeling all over, he didn't waste a minute giving Ronald the dirt he deserved. "I'm truly sorry." "It was an accident," Ronald explained, his brown eyes worried. Josh sighed, shaking his head. Although he was partly glad he just got hit in the head and whatever he saw was simply an illusion, despite it feeling so real. "I'm fine, Coach. Let's continue playing." For once, Coach McGurdy let go of her stoic toughness. "Are you sure, Josh? You can take a break if you need." "No," Josh exclaimed, standing up as his bruised knees wobbled. "I'm fine. Let's continue, boys." As Josh stood up, he pushed Ronald violently with his shoulder. Josh didn't look back to see his reaction. He didn't care. He walked towards the middle of the field, walking as if his legs were carrying a heavyweight. Josh himself was surely carrying a heavyweight internally. Josh placed his bruised hands on his thighs, and he squatted, keeping his eyes locked on the ball. The ball approached him and Josh caught it. He ran, forcing himself to forget the searing pain pulsing through his legs. Josh threw the ball towards his teammate. As the ball flew out of his hands, he felt a sharp pain on the palm that touched the ball. Josh quickly glanced at both of his hands. He flipped them over and inspected his palms. To his surprise, on his right palm was a tiny triangle-shaped bruise. He brought the hand closer to his eyes and observed it. It was a small triangle that had thick black lining. A black line shot through the middle of the triangle. Scrawled on the bottom of the symbol were the numbers 9346. Josh looked at it strangely. He dropped his hands to his sides and continued playing, but the only thing he could think about was how abnormal that bruise looked. 1-6 Ronald, September 4, 1946. After practice. Today was the first official practice for football this year. Ronald played well and he had fun. He enjoyed the rush of every touchdown he made and the team spirit of the game, even though it was just practice. To Ronald, that was heaven. Unfortunately, in the middle of it all, he accidentally chucked the ball at Josh. He was knocked out for a couple of minutes, but thankfully he wasn't seriously injured. When they were on opposite teams, Josh would purposely play rough with Ronald. However, the moment Ronald accidentally injured him, it was all his fault. It always confused and angered Ronald every time Josh shot him glares for no apparent reason. He recently found out the reason why Josh hated him was that he viewed him as competition for the football scholarship. Ronald desperately needed that scholarship and it frustrated him when Josh said he needed it more. He's filthy rich. Why can't he pay for the damn school himself? Ronald stepped out of the shower room and walked towards the locker room, fully clothed. He sat on the bench in the locker room and glanced over his shoulder. He noticed Josh applying rubbing alcohol on his bruises from the field. He sighed and swung his gym bag over his shoulder. Ronald stood up and approached Josh, tentatively at first, for fear he would make some crude remark. After gathering the courage, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Are you good, man?" he asked, genuinely concerned for his childhood friend. Josh had been sitting on the bench at the end of the locker room, alone. He had his elbows on his knees, his back was arched, and his dirty face was in his palms. Josh's fluffy brown hair covered his eyes and he was trying to hide the pain, but his position gave Ronald all the information he needed. Josh groaned after Ronald spoke, clearly stating that he did not want to be talking to Ronald. Spread out, he grunted through gritted teeth. Ronald chewed his lip and knitted his eyebrows, as his heart wrenched with a pang of sadness. "Listen, I seriously didn't mean to hurt you. It was an accident," he explained, desperately hoping Josh would understand. "I don't care. I don't care about you, Ronald. Leave me alone." Josh spat, lifting his head from his hands. His brows were furrowed and his green eyes were narrowed into slits, shooting Ronald his usual glare. "Why do you hate me so much? I understand now that I'm your competition for the scholarship, but that doesn't mean we can't be teammates," Ronald said, clenching his fists as a mixture of confusion and hurt washed over his face. "I don't care about you, Ronald. Just leave," he yelled, waving his overturned hands exasperatedly in the air. Ronald noticed that his temper was on a hair trigger. The smallest thing would have him flying into a rage, yelling and saliva spitting out with each jagged word. Ronald didn't say anything in response. His eyes caught and stared intently at Josh's palms, which were frantically waving in the air. Some sort of black ink was embedded in it. Confused, Ronald leaned closer and gazed at the weird shape. "What is that?" he asked, pointing at his overturned hands. Josh abruptly stood up, his temper having been triggered once again. When he stepped towards him, Ronald noticed that the bruises on his body were more severe than he initially thought. His white shirt was stained with mud and small red dots. His knees were bruised with reddish welts, and sunk deep into his coarse skin. Did I do this to him? Ronald couldn't help but wonder. All he recalled was chucking a mere football at his face. "I said leave. Why the hell do you care?" "Scram!" Josh snapped, his messy hair furiously swishing around. Ronald sighed and walked out of the locker room, leaving Josh all by himself. His heart pounded with frustration and rage, forgetting the strange bruise on his hands. All he could think about was how Josh was relatively nice to everyone except him. What did I do wrong back then? Jessica was waiting for Ronald outside the school building. She sat on the wooden bench with one leg crossed over the other, chewing pink bubblegum. "What took you so long?" she asked with an irritated tone, as Ronald approached his girlfriend. "I apologize. I was held up in the locker room," Ronald explained, gazing around the school and his surroundings. Everything around Willesden was quite gray, for lack of a better word. The trees sagged and had a gloomy air around them. The school lived as if it was under a constant shadow. There was no sun overhead, instead gray clouds stirred the sky. Therefore, the windows were black without the rippling effect of the light, never knowing that the dust that clings, the dirt of years, could so easily be washed away. The walls were cold to the touch, stealing the heat from warm fingers that dared to graze its surface. The school grounds were mainly abandoned, and no students could be seen outside after school. Though everyone at Willesden was used to the atmosphere, they couldn't imagine a different place to live in. Jessica stood up and sighed, and they both walked down the sidewalk towards their homes. Jessica would always walk with Ronald to his house first so that Ronald would never see her house. Ronald felt ashamed every time they did this because he lived in a broken wooden shaft. Whereas from what Jessica told him, she lived in a modern mansion. It seemed to him that Jessica didn't want Ronald to feel like he was the second place in their relationship, which of course didn't work. Ronald always felt like second place. Next to Jessica, next to Josh, and even next to Olivia. He wanted to be friends with Josh simply to be in that place again. He wanted to date Olivia, the #1 girl, just to experience that feeling. Of course, there was no way he could ever get Olivia, even if he tried really hard. Josh started dating Olivia last year out of spite when Ronald told him and his friends about his crush on her. That angered Ronald a lot, but there was nothing he could do about it. He wanted to ask her about what she thought of that. "Hey Jess," Ronald began before Jessica stared angrily at him with her icy blue eyes. "Remember what I said?" Don't call me Jess, I hate it, she said, her blonde ponytail swishing behind her as they walked. Ronald nodded his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. Sorry, he sheepishly apologized. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared gloomily at the ground. Ronald decided not to tell Jessica what he was about to ask. Instead, he looked at her, his dark brown eyes wide with concern. Are you all right? He asked, inching closer towards her. Jessica looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with despair. I guess, she replied softly. Her gravity-drawn shoulders painted a picture of her heart, as if neither it nor her soul would welcome a beat. You don't seem okay, Ronald commented, his heart heavy with worry. What's buzzin'? Ronald never really liked Jessica in a romantic way. She was pretty, but he only asked her out because he thought it would get him closer to Olivia, her best friend. Ronald had no idea why Jessica even agreed, but it didn't matter. He and Jessica were good friends nonetheless, although during the time they've been dating they haven't kissed, or even held hands. It was like they both knew that this relationship wasn't going to go anywhere, and wasn't rushing to make it happen. Jessica sighed and bit her tiny rosy lips. Ever since, she muttered, her gaze cast to the ground and her words not making any sense to Ronald. Never mind what I said. Ronald shook his head. No, please tell me. I don't like seeing you sad and off the beam, he said worriedly. Anyone who knew Jessica personally would know that she always kept to herself. She was quiet and seemed gloomy most of the time, although no one ever knew why she was such a dead battery. Ronald noticed that today she was even less than her usual self. She inhaled the thick air sharply, before mustering the courage to speak. Please don't tell anyone, okay? Jessica started, outstretching her pinky finger for Ronald. Promise, he agreed, locking pinky fingers with her. Yesterday during lunch I experienced something absolutely crazy, she began, looking up at Ronald. Why? It's hard to explain, but... Jessica took another deep breath, hastily deciding to spill it all in one go. I saw a girl that looked like me, I suppose. It was truly terrifying and horrendous. We were in the powder room and she touched me, which felt so creepily real. Then she suddenly disappeared. Afterwards, this peculiar mark appeared on my palm. Jessica rambled, watching Ronald's face go from concern to bewilderment. Huh? He sputtered, dumbfounded. Jessica bit her lip and showed him her right palm. That was when Ronald realized that Jessica might be saying the truth. Are you sure? He asked, squinting his eyes at the black triangle stamped on her slender palm. I know it sounds crazy and it seems hard to believe, but I swear it was real. One would think so too if it happened to them. I simply cannot erase that horrifying sight out of my head. I couldn't sleep at all last night. Plus I cannot help but wonder why. Why me? She rambled frantically. Ronald listened to her carefully, wanting to support her and be caring, but he couldn't bring himself to completely believe it. So, you're saying you saw a demon girl in the powder room, and then suddenly that symbol appeared on your hand. Are you sure that isn't a marker that you used to draw on yourself? Ronald questioned in disbelief. Jessica shook her head, her blue eyes wide. I'm serious. I tried scrubbing it off this morning with soap and water. It didn't come off. Not even a smear. She exclaimed, thinking that if she said it faster it would make Ronald believe her. Ronald tilted his head, still puzzled. But that doesn't make sense. Perhaps it was a dream, Jessica. Don't let it flip your wig. Do you believe me or not? Jessica interrupted, snapping harshly. After a moment of silence, her eyes shifted to the side again and became glazed with a glossy layer of tears. As she blinked, they dripped from her eyelids and slid down her cheeks. She bit her lip tightly in an attempt to hide any sound that wanted to escape from her mouth. Please. I've been feeling so lost, she whispered, her lower lip quivering. Ronald pulled her in for a hug, his strong arms wrapped around her petite body. I deeply apologize, Jessica. I believe you and there's no need to worry, he softly whispered into her ears, as she rested her delicate head on his chest and quietly wept. As they embraced, providing each other comfort in this gloomy world, Ronald's eyes suddenly shot open. His heart skipped a beat and his vision grew blurry. A queasy feeling entered his senses, like how one's stomach feels before it vomits. His brain synapses suddenly fired up and flashbacks from earlier that day entered his mind. He was taken back to the moment when he and Josh were arguing, and he had peered to look at Josh's hand. At that moment Ronald realized something. They were the same. The marks were the same. He suddenly gasped out loud as a painful throb came from his right palm. Jessica looked up at him, noticing his agony. "Did something happen, Ronald?" she asked, sounding concerned about him for the first time since they started dating. Ronald gulped as a queasy feeling churned within his stomach. He slowly shook his head and gave her a timid smile. "We should go home." He sat on his bed in his rundown house. The walls in his room were dark brown, made of wood. His 3 younger siblings were downstairs, and their yelps could be heard from upstairs. Ronald had his head in his hands, and his mind was shaking. All he could think about was the marks. He knew for a fact that he never looked at the marks closely enough to read what was written on them. However, for some reason, the flashbacks he's been having told him. 9-3-46. The flashbacks were a constant cycle, never leaving. Ronald could barely see the reality going on in front of him. All he could see were the images. It was always the same image of Josh's and Jessica's palms. The same thing over and over repeating in his head. He felt like he was drowning and there was no hope of being saved. The blackness of his memories spread through his mind, clouding his thoughts and taking him back to places he never wanted to revisit. He pressed his palms to his ears and tried to block out the visions, but it didn't work. They only flashed brighter and brighter. Tears formed and splashed down his face. He wanted the image to leave his head. I get it. I get it. Leave. Go. I don't care. I don't care about you. Go. Ronald squeezed his eyes. His headache was increasing at a rapid rate. He felt like his brain was going to explode as kicked his legs, screaming in anguish. He hastily laid down on his bed, his hands still gripping the sides of his head. Ronald wanted to claw the images out of his head using his own hands. He was that desperate. He began flapping his arms almost comically. He shook his head furiously and screamed, "Go away." Ronald willed his eyes to open, hoping to see his normal bedroom before him. To his despair, all he could see was the symbol, over and over again, replaying in his brain. He could barely see his broken desk except only through fuzzy eyes. He decided to take slow deep breaths, but it didn't work. He tried to relax his nerves, but it didn't work. Ronald cried and screamed, wanting it all to be over. He screamed louder, and suddenly the door to his room shot open. "Ronald, why are you screaming?" his dad shouted, bursting into the room. Ronald gasped and the images suddenly disappeared. All he could see was his father standing in front of him, his face angry but also contoured with worry. Ronald widened his eyes, letting out a huge sigh of relief in between quiet pants. "And nothing, Dad. I'm fine," he said, his voice shaky and his heart beating rapidly. "You don't look fine, Ronald. Tell me, what could have possibly happened?" his father asked worriedly. Ronald opened his mouth to reply. He took his hands off his head, then clenched and unclenched his fists repeatedly. Before he could speak, a burning sensation erupted from his right hand. He looked down and there it was. His traumatized eyes widened, and tears dripped down his cheeks once more. He realized now that Jessica was saying the truth. Whatever this symbol meant and whatever was happening was very real. "And nothing, Dad. Nothing happened." 1. 7 Utah, September 5, 1946. Homeroom. Utah was beginning to get used to his classes and teachers, although navigating the school building was still difficult to handle. His day was a constant routine with the same drab teachers minus Mr. Stevenson and the same boring classes, although there were times of the day that he enjoyed for specific reasons. He enjoyed homeroom because he was with Carter and his favorite teacher. Then gym class because he was also with Carter, and lunch because he sat with Carter. Swim practice was also fun yesterday because he was with Carter. So far his only friend was Carter. Utah sat in his seat for homeroom, giddy on the inside but careful not to show it on the outside. His dark narrow eyes glazed around the classroom, waiting for Carter to enter. There were some students already sitting in the room when Utah arrived, like Jimmy for example. He gave the boy an awkward wave as he sat down. The next group of people who entered were the Pink Girls. Utah didn't know their names and he didn't care. He continued staring at the door, eagerly waiting for Carter. They have gotten to know each other better over the past 2 days. Utah learned that Carter was in the swim team since freshman year. and that he was the first junior to become captain of the team. In his sophomore year, he earned a silver medal at the regional swimming race. That was a fascinating achievement for Yuta. Yuta told Carter a lot more about himself than he expected. Although he tended to be closed off when talking about himself, Carter was easy to talk to. He listened with his big silver eyes and nodded his head, soaking in every word and responding accordingly. It felt comforting since no one ever talked to him like that before. Perhaps one day he would feel comfortable enough to tell him the true reason as to why he transferred schools. Although, when conversing with Carter, Yuta had to constantly remind himself to be wary of the words that left his mouth. His mischievous friend could perhaps bring out the secret he stored deep within him, and Yuta had no intention of revealing it. Not only would Carter think he was entwined in the foolish fantasies of a child, but he would also be deemed as an outcast, even more than he already was. Finally, Carter walked into their homeroom class. Yuta instantly jumped up from his slumped position and waved at the silver-haired boy. Carter waved back with a beaming smile. Once Carter sat down at his desk to the left of Yuta and settled down, they both turned around to face each other. "So, what did you make of swimming practice yesterday?" Carter asked giddily. Yuta grinned, although the delirious happiness he was feeling didn't match his forced blank eyes. "It was splendid. I had such a whoopee. What do you make of the team?" Carter asked as he swiped his gray bangs off his forehead to see Yuta clearly. "Your team is quite killer diller." Yuta replied, unsure of what else to say. He flushed embarrassedly as Carter's eyes burned into his, caught off guard by the boy's short response. Although what he said was true, because to Yuta the swim team was the best thing he experienced at Willesden so far, besides befriending Carter. At first, Yuta wondered if he should be scared of the water. All the doubts that flooded his mind instantly stopped when he jumped in the air and time froze. He felt pumped and more alive than he had ever thought possible. All the mundane worries of his life had been muted, and all there was to think about was that moment. No worrying about the past and no anxiety about the future. His usually bleak eyes swiftly popped out of its sockets and sparkled, thrilled to be alive. With one adrenaline-fueled warrior yell, he remembered leaping into the glassy pool with nothing but air beneath his feet. "It's your team too," Carter remarked slyly, turning to organize his notebooks and pencils. A small smile spread across his face, and it caused random sensations of happiness to erupt with him. Yuta could tell he rarely gave smiles out, and when he did, it strangely warmed him in places the sun could never reach. Yuta caught on to the organization routine Carter was doing and did the same, thinking everyone had to do it at school. "I also think it is swell that you won a silver medal last year," he added shyly. Carter looked up and smiled at Yuta, elated that he brought it up. "It is quite swell. I'm proud of myself. And the team, of course," Carter commented, subconsciously puffing his chest outwards and straightening his back as pride glimmered in his eyes. "Are you lads talking about the swim team?" a squeaky voice asked from behind them. Yuta and Carter hesitantly turned to look behind them simultaneously. A pair of gleaming hazel eyes peered at them through big round-rimmed glasses. The boy sitting behind him was extremely short for a teenager, and his flaky blonde hair was sticking up in awkward places, as if he had been in contact with electricity. Snot was dribbling down his nostril, and Yuta almost gagged at the sight. "Americans are crazy." Carter looked at the short boy strangely, as he had never formally met him before. "Yes," Carter replied, after a moment of hesitation. "Who the hell are you?" "Hi-de-ho. The name is Jimmy," the stunted boy replied, holding out his left hand for Carter to shake. Carter declined, wary of what that hand must have touched. Jimmy nodded his head stiffly as he pulled out a piece of snot. "To be frank, the Willesden swim team is quite sub-zero," he remarked matter-of-factly. "They only won one medal last year." "I'm the one who won the medal because I'm the captain," Carter interrupted, shaking his head at the inferior boy. Jimmy shrugged as if that achievement didn't amaze him as it did to Yuta. He leaned towards Yuta and snapped his fingers in front of him, grabbing the boy's attention. "Hey new kid. Ditch the old hat swim team and join the chess club. We are killer diller," Jimmy stated, giving Yuta a pointed look. Yuta didn't know what to say or how to react, so he simply nodded his head awkwardly. Although it seemed that Carter had a lot to say, as he took great offense to Jimmy's statement. "Are you kidding me? The swim team won silver in the regional competition. I never heard of the Hairy Chess Club winning any medals, Carter protested, his eyebrows furrowed with frustration. Yuta was slightly intimidated at the discourse that was going on in front of him, so he quietly watched the encounter unfold. Jimmy shook his head, sighing as he placed the snot on his finger to the side of his desk. The Willesden Chess Club won gold in the national competition, he stated, adjusting his round glasses with a smug gleam in his eyes. That fact did not shut Carter up. Don't be such a grandstand. No one cares because the chess club is full of schnooks and geezers, he retorted, growing furious by the second. Jimmy rolled his eyes skyward and turned to meet Yuta's befuddled gaze. Trust me, any club is better than the swim team. It barely has any members anymore. That's how much of an old hat it is. Yuta bit his lip, unsure of what to say. All he could think about was Jimmy's snot hanging on the side of his desk. From beside him, Carter rolled his eyes at Jimmy and exchanged a disgusted glance with Yuta. My father and mother served in the war. They won many more medals than your pathetic chess club did in 1 year, Carter added snidely, throwing Jimmy a superior glare. My father served in the war too, Yuta chirped, eager to jump into a conversation he had experience with. Carter raised his eyebrows at Yuta, his face scrunching in a similar grimace that he gave Jimmy. I suppose, but he served with the Axis, not the Allied. It doesn't count, he remarked passive-aggressively. Before Yuta could protest, Mr. Stevenson clapped his hands, grabbing the student's attention. Good morning, class, he exclaimed. Today for homeroom we're going to do an icebreaker. I assigned everyone into groups of 3, and a sheet full of questions will be passed around. I want you all to complete the activity by the time this class is over. Have fun, folks. Mr. Stevenson excitedly instructed. He pointed towards the black chalkboard behind him, where all the groups were listed. The students jumped up from their seats and walked towards the board to find their groups. As Yuta squinted to read the board, he realized that he was with Olivia and some girl named Jessica. Unfortunately, Carter was with Jimmy and a girl named Barbara. Yuta pouted when he read who Carter was with. You're with Jimmy, he sadly muttered to Carter, as he walked towards his seat. I know. No need to remind me, he grumpily replied, stuffing his hands in his pockets as he grudgingly returned to his seat. You've got it worse. Yuta furrowed his eyebrows. Why? Olivia is decent. Carter looked at him, his mouth agape. Olivia isn't decent, she's greeby. She's a bratty glitteratty and the #1 most popular girl in this school. You're also with Jessica, her best friend. She's Olivia 2.0 fathead. Carter explained, his eyes wide with hatred. When he scanned Yuta's indifferent expression, he shook his head disappointedly. You have a lot to learn about this school, Yuta. Carter is right. You have a lot to learn about this school, said Mr. Stevenson's voice from behind Yuta. Surprised, Yuta turned around and shuddered as a shiver went up to his spine from the sudden scare. However, first you must learn about each other, Mr. Stevenson added, laughing. Get to your groups, boys. Carter chuckled with Mr. Stevenson and nodded, trotting towards his group. Yuta gave his teacher a timid smile, still caught off guard by the sudden scare, before he slowly walked towards Olivia. She was sitting on top of her desk in the second row. Her tanned legs were crossed over the other, and she wore a pink A-line skirt that was embedded with diamond jewels. Olivia was engrossed with looking at herself through a pink hand mirror, puckering her lips as if she was unfazed about collapsing in the detention closet yesterday. Beside her was a girl with blonde hair tied into a high ponytail. She stood on the ground, her arms crossed as she waited for Olivia to finish. Her blue checkered midi dress matched her starry eyes that were cast on the ground. Yuta realized that this was the girl who sat in front of him in this class. So this must be Jessica. Hello, Yuta greeted, quietly and awkwardly. The girls didn't hear him, so he stepped closer towards them. I'm in your group, he introduced louder this time. Only Jessica heard as she spun her head and scanned Yuta from top to bottom. Who might you be? She flatly asked as her glum blue eyes met his black ones. She spoke in a dry and bored tone as if she couldn't be bothered about the world outside of her bleak one. Yuta. I'm in your group, he replied, smiling at her. I suppose you could call me the rookie of this class, he said, chuckling to himself. She didn't respond, much to his embarrassment. He quietly observed the girl in front of him, and could instantly tell just by the way she walked that she was insecure. Her shoulders are hunched over as if she's hiding the treasure inside of her, and her arms were crossed in a closed-off manner. Her footsteps were light and timid when she slowly approached him, scrutinizing him through skittish eyes. She gave him a frown in return. It wasn't bold, but it wasn't anything pleasant either. If she smiled even a little, her true beauty would be showcased, Yuta assumed. Her complexion was fair and the color of her dark blue eyes was mesmerizing, although they looked shattered. He felt an urge to pick up the broken pieces, but it was pointless trying to fix someone who couldn't see their own truth. Olivia jumped down from her desk and pushed Jessica out of the way to face Yuta. She scanned him and, once again, Yuta felt slightly intimidated by her judgmental gaze. "I feel like I've seen you before," she commented, while snobbily chewing on pink bubblegum. "Well, I'm in your class," he softly pointed out. Olivia dismissed him and rolled her eyes while stalking towards Jessica's desk, not allowing him to talk to her any further than 3 seconds. Yuta glimpsed at Jessica, and she gave him a wordless shrug. She followed Olivia and sat beside her. "Why, I suppose we must start this," Olivia huffed, reapplying her lip gloss for the 100th time. Jessica rested her cheek on one hand, wearing a bored expression. Yuta tentatively trailed behind and sat on the other side of the desk. Girls are confusing, he thought, scratching his head. Once they received the sheet, they prepared to begin the activity. Before Yuta could speak, Olivia plopped her and Jessica's sheets in front of him. "Why are you giving me that?" he asked, raising his eyebrow with confusion. "Supposed to be yours to fill out." "Huh," Olivia exclaimed, her brown eyes wide with disbelief. "Why, did you seriously say that?" Olivia shouted again and the entire class turned around to stare at their group, wondering why she was screaming. "Oh my," she dramatically sighed, flipping her hair and rolling her eyes. Jessica explained to this fathead what the rules are around here. Rule number 1, if you're in a group with Olivia, then somebody must do all the work for her. Only exceptions are those part of her squad and her boyfriend, she explained in a monotonous voice. Olivia's brown curls bounced off her shoulder as she nodded with agreement. "Hear that? Do you understand now?" she asked, her eyes still wide with fury. She spoke in a tone that expected him to nod his head obediently. Instead, Yuta raised his eyebrows, wondering why she was getting heated over a trivial matter. Those eyes looked different yesterday, he thought to himself. Although he felt uneasy about having to do all the work, he hesitatingly nodded after a moment. "Swell," Olivia huffed, pulling out her pink mirror. "Why, I can't believe I wasted my breath on him," she snottily muttered to Jessica. Jessica mindlessly nodded her head, her eyes devoid of any emotion. Yuta scanned the handout, realizing he couldn't fill out some of the personal questions. As he looked up to ask them a question, he noticed Jessica's right hand that was propped beneath her chin had a bandage wrapped around it. "Jessica, what happened to your hand?" he asked, pointing to her bandaged hand. She jerked her head up and instinctively brought her hand to her chest, covering it with her other hand. It was the first time she conveyed any sort of emotion besides boredom. "And nothing. It's just a paper cut," she quietly answered. Yuta shot her an incredulous look. There was no way she would use a bandage that covered so much of her palm for a simple paper cut. "Are you sure? It appears to be something dire." Olivia had overheard their conversation and turned to look at Jessica with widened eyes. "Oh my, I didn't even notice, Jess. Why a paper cut? Why, remember what I said about keeping your hands spiffy?" Olivia exclaimed as she grabbed her bandaged hand, only to examine her nails. Jessica nodded her head and timidly smiled at Olivia. "Yes, I know. I apologize." There was something about the tone of her voice and the smile she gave Olivia. On the surface, it would fool anyone, even Olivia. However, her droopy eyes desperately asked for nurture. She had the appearance of a vulnerable animal that has experienced intense suffering. Yuta felt pity for both of them. Came from nowhere, but at the same time there were reasons. Yesterday, during science class, he opened the detention closet and saw Olivia sitting on the chair, although she didn't look like her usual bratty self. Her dark brown hair was damp with sweat, her glossy lips were quivering, and tears were rolling down her caked face. The sight shocked him and he asked if she was okay. The girl looked up at him with her genuinely terrified brown eyes and collapsed onto the floor. He could tell that something was going on beneath the surface. They were both known as the snobbiest and richest girls of the school, But he could see the pain beneath it and their souls drowning in this persona they carved to fit a world of indifference. "Olivia, about yesterday. Are you feeling any better?" Yuta abruptly asked, with a concerned tone. He hoped that Olivia would possibly tell him what happened to her in there. It seemed quite strange as to why her behavior suddenly shifted after a mere 30 minutes in the detention closet. Olivia broke her attention away from Jessica and met Yuta's gaze, her eyes wide. It was at that moment she realized Yuta remembered. "What?" she hissed through gritted teeth. He realized that despite the fact he noticed a glimmer of agony in Olivia's eyes, that didn't mean she was suddenly going to confide in a stranger about her pain. He didn't know why he brought up that topic, considering who he was talking to. "I should just know my place." However, Yuta swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to continue. "There is no going back now," he reasoned. "Why, you said you had a stomachache the other day." "Are you shut up?" Olivia shouted, her eyes flaming. However, the anger in her eyes showed the scared child within, masking it with excuses. "Just shut up. Don't you know the rules?" Yuta's eyebrows arched to the ceiling, taken aback and suddenly forgetting about the deep analysis he did of her earlier. "Which rule did I violate this time?" he thought, biting his lip to suppress the irritation he suddenly felt. Olivia flipped her hair and glanced intensely at Jessica, signaling her to talk. Jessica had frozen in place at that moment, her mouth agape as she stared at Yuta. She blinked her eyes and surprisingly, a small grin grew on her face. Rule number 2. If you are not part of Olivia's squad or her boyfriend, don't ask personal questions. You are a pain in the neck, new kid, Olivia spat, flipping her hair intensely again. She rolled her eyes and pushed her chair back, not wanting to be affiliated with him anymore. Yuta shrugged, not caring. He quickly realized that the least Olivia was going to do was yell at him. While Olivia was busy being Olivia and ignoring her group, Jessica leaned towards Yuta. "How did you get away with doing that?" she suddenly questioned, whispering as her stunned face neared him. Her flowery aroma engulfed his senses, and Yuta couldn't help but blush a little. As she leaned, he noticed that her button nose looked like a cartoon character. On the face of ivory-hued skin, her nose was a bump just above her dusky pink lips. There were no two ways about it, she was cute. What do you mean?" "I do not recall doing much," he stuttered as flustered emotions shot through his veins. He unwilling swallowed the lump in his throat and twiddled his thumbs nervously underneath the desk. Jessica shook her head, the ends of her mouth twitching into a grin. "I don't think you understand what it means to break so many of her rules," she remarked slyly. However, the way she spoke wasn't in an angry tone but an amazed one. Her soft voice was like music under a summer breeze, almost lost against the chattering of students in the classroom. Yuta shrugged and pursed his lips, eager to hear more of her voice. "I don't care about her foolish rules," he brazenly stated, glimpsing at Olivia who sat far enough away from them. She was blowing on her pink nails and staring at her complexion at the same time, too entranced with her beauty to care about the commotion around her. Jessica grinned at that comment, appearing quite pleased for the first time since he has met her. Yuta gazed at her smile that shined like the stars in the sky, with no bright city lights to dim them. It was like the sun opened its eager light to shine on her, only brightening her perfectly aligned teeth and her glittering blue eyes. He was about to open his mouth and tell her that she should smile more when someone interrupted. One of the football lads from across the classroom approached their desk, slamming it to grab their attention. Yuta jumped up like a scared black kitten, the tiny hairs on his arms pricking up. "Oh my gosh!" Olivia exclaimed, beaming up at him. She shook her arms cutely and grabbed her boyfriend's balled fists. "What are you doing here, you swoony?" Yuta noticed that her voice suddenly turned high-pitched again. It was as if she had two different faces depending on the person she was talking to. Josh shrugged nonchalantly, clearly not as excited as Olivia. "I came here because my partner is Ronald." "He's such a bother," Josh explained, rolling his eyes as he rubbed the back of his neck. Josh's eyes flipped over to glance at Jessica. "No offense, Jessica." "None was taken," she muttered, averting her eyes. Yuta pouted when he noticed that her beautiful smile disappeared the moment Olivia began talking. "So Olivia, is the new kid snapping your cap?" Josh asked, sweeping his brown hair off his forehead handsomely. "I heard you screaming," Josh added, winking at Olivia, which caused her to squeal. Yuta had to admit, the way he held himself was captivating. He assumed that he was a lady's boy, considering the number of heads that turned when he walked across the room. Why yes. He's been giving me a lot of trouble, she answered, pointing towards Yuta, who was sitting across from her. She pursed her lips, passing the buck. Yuta didn't even have time to bat an eyelash because Josh suddenly grabbed his black shirt with his hands. He brought the boy close to his austere green eyes, with the strength of one hand. He jumped to sit on top of Jessica's desk so that he loomed over Yuta and emitted dominance over him. One foot was propped on Yuta's chair, blocking him from escaping. What did you do to her? He asked, gritting his teeth and flaring them at Yuta. Yuta blinked at him, unfazed since Josh's eyes didn't emit any harm. Nothing, I was just trying to complete the activity, he stated, shrugging. Olivia's jaw dropped to the floor, along with a tube of her pink lipstick. Liar. He's passing the buck, Joshie, she shouted with a snarl. Yuta wondered how much energy it took for someone to scream as much as she did. If he was Olivia, he would have fainted due to exhaustion by now. Josh grabbed Yuta by the collar and yanked him close until their eyes truly met. Tell me the truth, new kid, he hissed through gritted teeth. This time Yuta was intimidated. He quickly realized that despite his charm, Josh was, simply put, as much of a jerk as Olivia. He reminded him of his friends from his old school, the ones that would grab his shirt and flare their teeth at him. Sorry, Yuta quickly muttered, apologizing to both of them. His head lolled to the side as he shut his eyes, praying that Josh won't punch him. Olivia shot him a disgusted look. Is that the only English word you know? Sorry, she retorted, impudently. Yuta blinked as uneasiness washed over his face. So now your boyfriend is going to knuckle sandwich me because I broke one of your stupid rules. He suddenly remarked, feeling a distaste towards Olivia now. I can't believe I felt sorry for that bitch. From across the desk, Jessica gaped at Yuta, her eyes wide with amusement. Olivia stared at Yuta too, except with pure hatred burning in her eyes. Josh's fist still clung onto Yuta's shirt, and his green eyes pierced into Yuta. Slowly, a smile appeared on his face, that he hid from Olivia by tilting his head. Yuta looked at him, surprised by this sudden change of emotion. Huh, Josh muttered. You're gassed, Jap, he remarked, letting go of Yuta's shirt. Then he jumped off the desk and turned to face Olivia. He grabbed her hands and she stood up, both of them indulging in a disgusting smooch. They made weird kissing sounds that caused Yuta to grimace. Olivia seemed to have quickly forgotten about Yuta, but Jessica surely had not. Oh my, Jessica said, turning to face Yuta. They were the only ones left sitting, and she had the hugest smile on her face. I can't believe you just said that, she whispered to him excitedly. Her blue eyes danced in the sunlight that peeked from the window beside them, as they gazed at Yuta with awe. Yuta shot her another puzzled look, but with a hint of intrigue glistening in his black eyes. Why are you so happy about it, Cookie? He asked, slyly leaning towards her. Jessica shook her head, ignoring his question. Why, you broke so many of her rules. She may be cutting you some slack for now since you're a rookie. However, if you keep getting into rhubarbs with her, she is going to end you, Jessica stated, every part of her beautiful face beaming. And how is she going to go about that? Yuta jokingly asked, a smug smile appearing on his face too. Both palms cupped his chin as he stared at Jessica intently, interested in what she had to say. Jessica looked down at the desk and giggled timidly. She's going to get Josh and his football skirt nerds to gang up on you. So stop, she answered, biting her lip to refrain from laughing out loud. Yuta shrugged, unafraid to express his emotions around her. I don't care. Let them. Jessica gasped and covered her mouth with her hands, attempting to muffle her laughter. Do you want me to stop? He asked, arching an eyebrow. Yuta had a feeling he knew what was going on here now. Jessica looked up at him and paused. She inhaled deeply and confidently shook her head. No, she whispered, exhaling. Yuta could tell she desperately wanted to say that out loud for some time. Tell me where you get the moxie to break her rules, you swoony, Jessica added, returning the smile. First, tell me what's all the rage about the rules. Do the pink girls have to obey them too? Yuta asked, grinning. He was starting to enjoy Jessica's company, and he was hoping for an unlikely friendship to be born. She was quite an interesting person, once he looked past her glum expressions. Pink girls. Jessica questioned, her eyebrows raised. Yuta chuckled and shook his head, flustered. That's the name I came up with for Olivia and her khaki-wacky friends. You're part of them too, right? Jessica sighed and nodded unimpressively. We're officially called Olivia's Squad. Yuta snorted, his eyes wide with disbelief. No way. That's quite a cheesy group name. It is, she exclaimed, nodding her head. Pink Girls is a little crummy though, she remarked, pursing her rosy lips. It's better than the self-titled Olivia Squad, Yuta remarked, shrugging. Jessica nodded in agreement and they both laughed. Before Yuta could say anything else, Mr. Stevenson interrupted. Josh, Olivia. I can hear you necking like birds. You should be grateful I am choosing not to send you to the principal's office for this. Now scram and return to your work. Mr. Stevenson said, from the teacher's desk at the front of the classroom. Once Olivia returned to her seat next to Jessica, she shot Yuta a glare, as if it was his fault she got in trouble with the teacher for making out with Josh. Yuta exchanged a knowing glance with Jessica and she quietly laughed. That makes sense, Yuta thought to himself. Jessica hates Olivia. As they worked, which was more like Yuta doing all of it and Jessica quietly helping out, Carter glanced at them from his seat a couple of desks away. Jealously flooded his eyes, but Yuta didn't notice. Yuta dreaded going home. After school, he joined Carter for swimming practice. Carter suffered a minor injury, but the rest of the practice went well. Although the sport itself was a pleasure, without Carter he would not have enjoyed it nearly as much. Carter had a strange magnetic field around him and Yuta couldn't help but be pulled in by the boy's witty charm. So when Carter asked Yuta if he would like to wander around town with him after practice, he surprised himself with his response. I have got to go home now, Yuta said quickly, his mouth moving before his brain could catch up. Yuta blinked rapidly as he digested the words that came out of his mouth. No, I do not want to go home. Why did I say that? The boy grimaced awkwardly and pulled his black sleeves over his hands. Are you not the least bit curious about the Brownie Hawkeye camera? I heard only a couple of models have been shipped to Willesden, so we better grab a quick look, Carter said as they walked out of the school. Yuta wrapped his arms around his sinking stomach, envious of Carter's effortless ability to express his wants. I cannot go back on my word now. He already thinks I'm a cold fish, he thought sorrowfully, allowing his mind to shut as his mouth took control. Perhaps we can go another day, Yuta suggested, looking up at his friend's shining smile. Natch. See you tomorrow, Yuta, Carter said cheerfully, waving him goodbye as he turned the other way. Yuta gulped sadly as he watched Carter bounce home. I should have agreed to go with him. Yuta continued to berate himself for slipping his tongue as he stood alone in the courtyard. He glanced at the road that led to his home and his face darkened at the thought of what awaited him there. Rather than taking that road, he turned and ran back to the empty school. Tomorrow I shall go with Carter. Tomorrow I won't keep letting things I don't want happen to me. Tomorrow I shall be different, Yuta promised himself determinedly. As he burst through the heavy school doors, he wondered where the sudden surge of confidence came from. Perhaps Carter's demeanor rubbed off on him. Or perhaps it was the new school, with the promise of a better life. A better life. Yuta wasn't an idiot. He knew he had to take a stand for himself, if he wanted to fulfill that promise of a better life. But there still seemed to be something bringing him down. Yuta gazed up at the concrete ceilings, swiveled his head around to glance at the drab lockers, and stared down at the stained floor. A realization clicked as he took in his empty surroundings. He slowly brought out his hands and studied his overturned palms. There was something bringing him down. It was like a burden. He never forgot the day he met that violet-eyed woman on the beach. He didn't forget how she called him a witch either. At first, he thought it was a child's folly, but a couple of years later, when he read aloud some foreign words, a stream of white light burst from his palms. That's when he knew he was carrying a burden, a terrible secret that should never be spoken aloud for fear that the men his father fought against would throw him in a camp. What if Carter found out? What if Jessica heard about it? What would Mr. Stevenson think? What would Josh's judging face look like? He wanted to free himself of the burden, but how? He could not risk telling a soul, because it would ruin his plans for wanting a better life in this new town. Yuta wished it would go away. The war was over and he wanted to be free of all the dark secrets. It was extremely isolating, and Yuta yearned to be different. He yearned to fulfill that promise of a better life. But all this thing has ever done was bring him down. What did you do to me, woman? Yuta screamed into the empty hallway, clenching his fists and shaking them at the ceiling. You barely told me a thing. Now I'm cursed for life, and I do not know what it is I am cursed with. I want to start anew at this school. I want to fit in with the people here. I never asked for this abnormality. As Yuta dropped to his knees and wiped silent tears, the memory of the words he had read that day entered his mind. He never forgot what those words were, and never dared to speak them again. However, the increasing dissociation from his body, and the constant unawareness of who he truly was seemed to be the reason for his detachedness from the world. Oh, how he wished to rid himself of that. Perhaps repeating those words from the Black Book would give him a better understanding of the abnormality that he was. Anger bubbled in his heart, and he clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. I am willing to do whatever it takes. Crepitus. Go away. He yelled inwardly as his mouth spoke differently. He expected the white light to burst instantly, but when it came by so swiftly he was still surprised by the sheer force. Yuta unfolded his hands and noise erupted that left his ears feeling like they just exploded. His lungs were suddenly full of rotten egg smoke, and he couldn't see through the blinding light that shrouded the previously dimly lit hallway. The heat that burst from his hands felt like he had just shoved them in an oven, leaving blisters all over. Yuta flew backwards due to the force that was as strong as a volcano erupting, sending shockwaves underground. Surprisingly, Yuta was unfazed. Tears burst from his eyes and sweat lined the back of his neck, but he wasn't shaking. Fear did not erupt throughout his body. Rather, he felt a sense of amazement at what he had done, at what he had created. Through the uncontrollable streaming of his eyes, a dark figure that was akin to the one he noticed through the window on his first day of school flickered in between the streams of light. Yuta stumbled as he rose from the ground and squinted through the light. He could not see the figure clearly, and although it had spotted him doing something he shouldn't be doing, Yuta assured himself that a mere human wouldn't be able to walk through that white light since he couldn't get near it himself without the worry of burning a limb off. Human or not, something was taking slow steps through that stream of white light, and that thing was accelerating towards him. Yuta's eyes flew open in realization, and his instinct to run the other way kicked him right in the gut. The shock that he should have been feeling the moment he spoke the incantation only arrived when he began running to save his life from the phantom he seemingly conjured. Yuta screamed for help, only to be greeted by his own echoes bouncing off the school walls in return. Being chased brought out a primal fear in Yuta, and it drained every ounce of him. It emptied the reserve tank of the reserve tank. It was the kind of fear that ignored physical and mental pain in the pursuit of his safety. Help! Please, is anyone here? He yelled before tripping on a piece of the wooden floorboard that stuck out. As he skidded across the floor that caused the splinters he could feel tearing at his skin, Yuta did not dare to look behind. His fists shook by his sides and his heaving lungs refueled the oxygen that continued to drain. In between gasps of air and cries for help, all Yuta could think of was how much he hated himself. Perhaps I should just let the phantom get me. There's no point in outrunning the abnormal. Besides, I failed to get rid of this curse, so there's no better life for me no matter where I go. At this thought, Yuta slowly turned to face the shadowy figure but clenched his eyes shut. He stood still and waited for the shadow to crash into him. He was prepared to die. Although he didn't know what to expect, so he wondered perhaps the figure would wrap its icy fingers around his throat and strangle him. Or it could drag him across the floor and drown him in the school pool. The shadow could even paralyze him and whisper chilling words from his past. Perhaps it was able to morph into a monster that would be more of a frightening visual rather than psychological terror, yet still reflect his psychosis. Was it able to take control of his vision and only flash horrifying images in front of his eyes? The possibilities were endless, and Yuta couldn't stop creating them in his head, just like he created that white light. As he stood in the middle of the hallway, arms spread wide in anticipation of death, Yuta wondered why he hadn't felt anything yet. He assumed that by now, the light that felt like lava would have succumbed to his being and the phantom would have played out one of his scenarios. Yuta tentatively blinked his eyes open, hesitating due to fear that the thing was in front of him, patiently waiting to slit his throat. When Yuta's eyes were fully open, he saw nothing. No white light, no scorching heat emitting from the light, and no dark shadow slipping in between the streams. All that appeared around him was the concrete gray ceiling, broken lockers, and the stained floors of the Willesden High School hallways. What did I do? Yuta wondered anxiously, staring down at his blank palms as the world around him settled into an eerie stillness.